I can't say I necessarily enjoyed going out and exploring the countryside, but it is something that I did a whole lot when I was younger. I think mostly because living out in the country, there wasn't exactly a whole lot else to do. My family never had cable back then, because this happened so long ago and it wasn't available in such a rural area. Other than that, we also lived far enough away from any of my friends or relatives that we couldn't spend time with them often and do things together. So, a lot of my free time, especially in the summer, was spent exploring the countryside on my lonesome. I didn't know a lot about the history of the area that we lived in, and this was before it was easy to just look these things up on the internet. Because of this, I never knew if I would find anything interesting or noteworthy out there. I always thought it would be cool to come across an Indian Arrowhead or something like that. Like pretty much every kid in the world who goes out exploring in the country, I always hoped I would find something valuable out there one day. I mean, who knew if there was a gold piece stuck out there somewhere or something? Anyway, this one day in this one summer, I was really bored and went off exploring as usual. This time though, I tried heading off in a direction I hadn't really ever gone in before. I had avoided it mostly because my dad told me to. It was private property, I guess, and the man who owned it got very angry if he caught anyone out there. Plus, he claimed there were abandoned mines out there, and if I accidentally fell into one of those, it might be the last time anyone ever saw me alive. I went off in that direction, only slightly worried that one of these fates might befall me. I guess the slight fear made the hike a little bit more interesting. Other than that though, it was kind of fun thinking about the possibility of getting caught too. I don't know how long I had been out there, nor how many hills I had crossed over already. Eventually though, being on one side of a particular hill, I looked over at the one opposite facing it. I saw that inlaid about 3/4 of the way up the hill was what looked like either a cave or some sort of mine driven into the side. I assumed because of where it was most likely just a cave. It didn't look like it would be that easy to climb to, but it seemed very interesting to me, so I decided to go check it out. Getting to the opening was not easy. The hill was a whole lot steeper than the other ones I had experience with. After quite a bit of effort, including grasping onto trees that had thorns and caused my hands to bleed a little, I was finally able to make it up that steep hill and to the opening of this cave. I was actually a little bit apprehensive right away. This was the first such cave I had ever come across, despite all of the time I'd spent out there exploring. It was, as you might imagine, very, very dark, and I had only brought a small flashlight with me. I hadn't expected to come across a cave or be out after dark, so it was only one of those pen flashlights I always had with me in my backpack. It was a little damp inside, but that didn't really bother me so much. It was easy enough to avoid stepping into the water. Mostly, I was worried about the possibility of disturbing any bats that were in there. We didn't have as good an understanding about them back then as we do nowadays, so we thought that all bats bit, and they all carried rabies as well. It was bright enough at the opening. As I made my way into the cave though, I took out my pen light just in case I would need it. Of course, the very first thing I did was look at the ceiling to see if there were any bats inside. Fortunately, at least in concern of my feelings, I was happy not to see any in there. I probably would have screamed and started running had I seen even one of them. As I kept walking further into the cave, the light I got from the outside was now nearly gone. Soon, it was gone altogether. I suppose I should have headed back when it got to that point, but I was way too captured by curiosity with all of this. Although the entrance seemed to be a normal natural cave, further in it had wooden beams inside that looked like they had been made to reinforce the structure. Perhaps people had mined in this cave before. I mean, I didn't know enough about the differences between caves and mines to really know. The weirdest part though at this point were the echoes. My footfalls would sound like the footfalls of other people. A couple of times I even jumped, thinking that I heard someone following behind me. I was able to calm myself down after each try though, when suddenly I noticed something up ahead. It looked like something was lying on the ground up against the wall of the cave. It was too hard to make out in the dark at first, being that I only had this small light on me. However, as I got closer, I noticed something that stuck with me to this very day. There were bones in that cave. Although it was not a complete skeleton, I was able to tell there was a human skull there. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that before, and it truly scared me. I knew though that these bones had been there for a very long time, and whatever had killed this person couldn't possibly still be there to be a danger to me. But then I heard it. It sounded like someone whispering further down the cave. I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly at first, but when I froze and did my best to listen, I began to make it out clearer. There was absolutely someone whispering deeper in the darkness of that cave, echoing all the way up to me. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it was definitely a human voice. That was even scarier to me than finding that skull there. I got up and tried my best to hurry up out of the cave. I heard the whispering following behind me as I made my way back to the entrance. While I wasn't scared before going into the cave with the meager light, I was scared to death coming back out of it. I didn't want to run and make too much noise. If that person deeper in the cave was following me, I didn't want them to know exactly where I was. After I made it out, I ran down that hill fast as I could. I was very lucky not to fall down that steep slope and hurt myself. I don't know who could have been making those whispering sounds, but I never went back to find out. I had this really weird thing happen a few decades ago during the summer. Around that time, we lived in this beautiful house out in the country. My older brother and my stepmom's younger brother, who was about my age, would take turns hanging out at each other's houses. I personally didn't like hanging at her brother's house much because it was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I wasn't really a big fan of that town. On the weekends though, he would come over to our place, and we almost always went on a hike in the surrounding area. There was a ton of countryside we loved to explore. My brother and Pete, my stepmother's brother, were always out doing things together. And I mean really, really stupid things. Here are just a couple of examples. Once my brother wondered what it would feel like to piss on an electric fence, so he went and did it. Also, once at the top of the hill, there was a circular roll of hay. They decided to unravel it and roll it down the hill. Well, after they did that, every single cow that was grazing went running for that hay. We once came across a huge bulldozer sitting at the top of a hill too. They wanted to climb in the cab and mess with the gears, but fortunately I was able to talk them out of that one. One of the dumbest things I can recall them doing was taking a rock and throwing it at a bull's balls. Fortunately, when I found out they were trying to do something so moronic, I made my way up a tree before it happened. Even more fortunately for them, they were able to get up as well before being gored to death. So every time we went out on our little hikes together, I kept expecting these two guys to do something exceptionally stupid. Honestly though, the most memorable hike we ever didn't involve those two doing something stupid at all though. We'd had some frozen pizzas and watched some videos the night before, so we were really looking for something different to do on this day. We went out together. Now mind you, we lived really way out in the country. I mean, it took nearly an hour and a half to drive to the nearest town from where we were. The houses were obviously very far apart from each other as well. In fact, on the hill that we lived on, we were the first house up there. If you went further down the roads, it was nearly a 30-minute drive to the next house. We didn't know anybody in the area because of this. Plus, every single time we went out for an adventure, we never came across other people. We never came across any other hikers, we never stumbled across other houses. There were plenty of electric and barbed wire fences and animals, but no people to speak of whatsoever. On this particular day, we ended up spending a lot of time outside. I'd brought along a thermos of the worst flavored Kool-Aid, lemon lime. Whenever I tell this story, I can still taste that crap in my mind. We had been out for a really long time, walking across a few streams, climbing up and down hills. What was strange about this day, though, was that we were out a lot longer than we usually would be. Even when we ran out of stuff to drink, we just started drinking water from streams and creeks. As I was bending down to get a sip of water from a creek next to me, Pete came running up behind my brother and I. "Hey guys, you gotta see this, you won't believe this!" He was speaking in very whispered, excited tones. "Just don't make too much noise, okay? This is the freakiest thing I've ever seen." My brother and I followed close behind. He kept insisting we try not to make too much noise as we were walking. It was difficult because the ground was littered with dried and decaying leaves. He led us and crouched over to an area overlooking a creek, and that's when I saw the weirdest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Of course, keep in mind I was only 13 at that time. There was a huge man walking by the creek. I mean, he must have been the biggest man I'd ever seen. He was completely naked and covered in matted hair, which practically made up for not having clothes on. Even scarier, he was dragging a corpse behind him slowly. We couldn't tell if it was human or anything. It was skinned and he was dragging it along, which seemed quite weird to us. We all watched as he slowly walked back up the creek. I was trying not to make any noise because I was scared of this terrifying naked behemoth. I didn't want him to turn around and find us. If he did, I had no idea how he would react. That's why I was so tense. Remember how I told you earlier that Pete and my brother liked to do really stupid things when we went out? I just had every feeling they were going to do something to provoke this man's attention. I just remained as still as possible, ready to run faster than both of them if they did something dumb. Surprisingly enough to me, they were too scared to do so. The man kept dragging his corpse and eventually stumbled out of view. The whole thing was so bizarre, but what really got to me was this. Pete and my brother were willing to smack a bull in the balls with a rock, but they weren't willing to do anything to get this man's attention. That means they were more scared of what we saw that day than they were of a raging animal. Just let that sink in. Just to preface, I'm not going to include any actual details about myself, as I'm in pure fear that somehow this person will track this back to me. I, 24 and male, live in a quiet neighborhood in a suburban town in Queensland, Australia, with my roommate who's a 25-year-old woman. We're childhood friends and are both finishing our studies at university. These occurrences I'm about to tell you about started around 2 months ago, with the most recent update occurring only last weekend. About 2 months ago, I can't recall the exact date, I was lying in bed late at night, watching a soccer game and drifting in and out of sleep. I usually just use this as background noise to help me get to sleep easier, as I would say I'm a very nocturnal person by nature. I was just on the edge of being awake and asleep at once when I heard an urgent pounding at my front door. With the way the house was shaped, my bedroom was approximately 10 meters away from the front door and backed onto the front courtyard. The knock startled me at first. I was unsure if it was just in my head in a dream or actually happening. I laid still in silence to see if I would hear anything further. I knew it couldn't be my roommate, as she was out of town for the week visiting family and attending a wedding. After a bit of waiting, there was a second knock, just as hard. No one called out or said anything though. I'd like to say I'm not easily scared and enjoy watching horror movies in my free time, but suddenly I found myself frozen in place, not able to move at all. No further knocks came after, but I was too frightened now to fall back asleep and didn't end up resting until around 4 a.m. or so. I called my roommate the next morning, asking if she knew anyone that would have come to our door that late in the night. But she was just as confused as I was. A week passed by and I didn't really give it too much thought anymore. I sort of came to the conclusion that maybe it was some drunk person that had mistaken our house for theirs. It was a Saturday night when this happened. I work in a large chain grocery store doing night stacking a few days a week, with my shifts ending between 2 to 4 a.m. usually. It was the next Saturday, and I was approaching the end of my shift when my roommate texted me saying someone was knocking on the front door again. Even though I wasn't actually there, I was struck with that same kind of fear I had experienced just the week prior. She reassured me the doors were all locked, but was scared knowing the same thing had happened to me as well. She kept in touch with me until my shift was over and told me that this time there was no second knock. When I arrived home, the front yard was untouched and there was no one out walking the street either. I must reinstate that this is a very quiet neighborhood, with mostly elderly couples living on our street. In the morning, my roommate still seemed a bit shaken up, so I put in an anonymous tip with a Crime Stopper service. They never got back to me though. Nothing else seemed to happen for the following month and a half. We were both moving on with our lives like it never even happened. I stopped working Saturday night shifts though, as this was the only similarity between the two occurrences. That was until the most recent Saturday. I was up late in the living room, watching some old Black Mirror episodes as the new season was about to come out. It was about 1 a.m. or so, and I had plans to go to bed after that episode I was watching. For context, the room I was in was right next to the front door this time, with the path to the door going past a large window. As I was watching, I saw the outside motion sensor light turn on from the bottom of the windowsill, under the blinds. I froze up. Until this point, I had completely forgotten about that knocking, and I was struck with fear. A short moment later, an urgent knocking began. At first, I was going to sit there and wait for them to go away, but after a second loud knock, I decided to look through the peephole quietly and see if it was someone familiar. My roommate had had a few failed relationships that did not end on good terms, so I assumed maybe it was one of them trying to mess with her. But as I looked closer, it was not. It was a woman I had never seen before. She was just staring at the door, stood still like a statue. It was like she was frozen solid. Her eyes were staring straight ahead with no expression. It was like she could see me through the eye hole, just staring into my soul. She stood there for another 2 minutes or so until she looked to the side and ran off into the darkness. I called the cops and explained on the phone what had happened, and they sent someone shortly thereafter. They checked all the cars parked on the street, but came up empty-handed. They just told me to call back if anything happened again. The thing that I couldn't get out of my head, though, was the way she just stood there emotionless, staring straight ahead as if she wasn't thinking at all, and the strange way she ran off as well. She looked to be in her 30s or so, wearing a small nightdress and no shoes. Not exactly someone I'd ever seen in the neighborhood before. Not only was this out of the ordinary, but it was completely freezing outside as well. Since then, I've ordered one of those doorbell cameras, just in case she does come back. To be completely honest with you though, I flinch whenever someone knocks on that door now. This happened when I was in my teens. I can't remember exactly when, but I think I was around 17 or so at this point. It was the school holidays, and I was at home with my friend who we'll call Talia, and my domestic worker who we'll call Lasego. It was around 11 a.m. or so, and we were just hanging out in my room together. Lasego had been washing dishes when she glanced out of the window. In another window, she saw the reflections of 2 men in our backyard. She ran upstairs to tell me what she had seen, and I immediately hit the panic button. The alarms started sounding loudly throughout the house. I remember calling my dad to tell him what was happening, but he was working quite far away and would take some time to get there. I believe he called the police at that point. I wanted to run downstairs and lock the security gate at the bottom, but at that point, over the loud wailing of the alarm system, I could distinctly hear the crack of wood splintering as they broke in the back door of the house. I was worried they would be faster than me and decided not to go downstairs to lock the gate. Instead, we raced across the upstairs landing to lock ourselves in my parents' bedroom. We reached the bedroom door and fuck, there was no key. We ran back across the landing again. Just as we were passing the top of the stairs, we saw those 2 men bounding up them just a meter away. They were both extremely large, clutching in their hands a screwdriver and a rope. Not a good sign. Lesego tried to grab our cell phones from the guest room as we passed. One of the men slapped her across the face, grabbed the phones, and pushed her into the room. Talia and I kept running, with the two men just a couple of meters behind us. We reached the end of the landing, dashed into my mom's office, and slammed the door hard behind me. My heart sank as I heard the clink of the key hitting the opposite wall. It had been on the other side of the door. At this point, Talia was hysterical, crying in the corner with both hands on her head as I held the door shut. What are we gonna do? I felt strangely calm though. I just remember thinking I could not let anything happen to either of my friends. There was a knock on the door behind me. Hello? I was in utter disbelief as these two intruders calmly knocked on the office door as if what was happening was the most normal thing in the entire world. We didn't respond. They knocked again. Hello? Once again, we didn't respond. The two men started turning the doorknob and pushing the door open against my back. I tried to stop the knob from turning, but I couldn't get a good grip on it. I pushed back against them, digging my heels into the carpet as deep as possible. Just then, the phone started to ring. I knew it must be someone calling to help us. I shouted to Talia to answer the phone and tell them what was happening, and to speak loudly as well. I wanted the intruders to know someone was on their way. While she was on the phone with the security company, I was fighting with these two men with all my strength for control over this single door. They pushed it open wide enough for a small adult to slip through, and I shoved back with all my might to get it just about shut again. This struggle went on for what felt like forever, but in reality was probably only a few minutes. The whole time the alarm was blaring loudly. Eventually, the men gave up, and after waiting it out for a while, we felt safe enough to leave the room. My dad got there first, and we told them everything that happened. An armed response team arrived 40 minutes after we spoke to them on the phone. Yeah, geez, we'd already be dead or worse at that point. The police arrived 2 hours after them. Yeah, no one relies on the cops in South Africa. It was only when we were explaining the whole thing to the cops that the reality really started to set in and the adrenaline started to wear off. I went into shock and was all shaky for a bit. I felt grateful that everyone was okay in the end. I'm still amazed by what adrenaline can accomplish. How did my tiny teenage girl self hold back these two huge fully grown men? Completely insane. After that day, I realized just what I'm capable of when shit hits the fan, and also that if shit goes down, you're really on your own sometimes, and you need to have a plan, because chances are no one is getting there in time to actually help you.